I stood in the scorching heat of the Nevada desert, dust swirling around my ankles as the taillights of my son's BMW disappeared into the shimmering horizon. The gas station attendant had already gone back inside, shaking his head at what he'd witnessed. My purse sat heavy in my hands, containing exactly $17 and a maxed-out credit card. The sun blazed overhead like an angry eye, and the nearest town was 43 miles away. At 62 years old, I had been abandoned by the boy I raised, fed, and sacrificed everything for. But what Marcus didn't know as he drove away in the car I helped him buy was that his bank account was about to experience its own kind of desert. Empty. Barren. As unforgiving as the landscape. He left me in. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Connie Rivera, and for 34 years I thought being a mother meant giving until there was nothing left. I was wrong. Sometimes it means knowing when to stop. Before everything crumbled in that desert heat, my life revolved around one person. Marcus Antonio Rivera, born on a rainy Tuesday in October, 7 pounds and 3 ounces of pure possibility. His father disappeared before Marcus took his first breath, leaving me with a mortgage, a waitressing job, and a determination that my son would never want for anything. I was 28 then, young enough to believe love could substitute for money, old enough to know I'd have to work twice as hard to prove it. I grew up in East Los Angeles, the daughter of immigrant parents who cleaned office buildings at night and spoke in whispers about dreams they'd never see fulfilled. My mother, Elena, died when I was 19. Her hands still rough from industrial soap and her back permanently curved from years of bending over other people's messes. My father, Carlos, followed her 3 years later, as if he couldn't bear to live in a world without her steady presence. They left me their old Honda, a shoebox full of receipts, and a belief that hard work was the only currency that mattered. When Marcus arrived, I made a promise over his sleeping form in that hospital bed. He would go to college. He would wear clean clothes and eat fresh fruit and never know what it felt like to count quarters for lunch money. I would be the mother I'd always wanted, the one who showed up to every game, every recital, every moment that mattered. I would give him the childhood I'd never had. For 18 years I kept that promise. I worked double shifts at Rico's Diner, where the coffee was always burned and the customers treated servers like furniture. I picked up catering gigs on weekends, standing for hours in strangers' kitchens while they celebrated milestones I couldn't afford. Every extra dollar went into Marcus's future. Piano lessons when he showed interest in music, soccer cleats when he made the team, a laptop for high school when other kids were getting their first cars. I lived in the same small apartment, in Riverside for 15 years, the one with thin walls and a refrigerator that hummed like a dying animal. The rent was cheap, which meant more money for Marcus's needs. While other single mothers complained about their sons growing distant, Marcus and I remained close. He called me his best friend. He told me about girls he liked, classes he struggled with, dreams he harbored about becoming a successful businessman. He said I was the strongest person he knew. I believed him because I wanted to. Because when you're raising a child alone, those words become the fuel that keeps you moving when your feet ache and your bank account runs dry. Marcus was brilliant in the way that made teachers remember his name. He tested into advanced classes, won academic awards, and graduated valedictorian with a full scholarship to UC Berkeley. The night of his graduation, I sat in that audience wearing the only dress I owned, watching my son accept honors I'd never dreamed of achieving myself. When he mentioned me in his speech, calling me his inspiration and his hero, I cried so hard. The woman next to me offered tissues. This was it, I thought. This was what all those years of sacrifice had been building toward. My son would succeed where I had struggled. He would break the cycle of barely getting by that had defined my family for generations. The pride I felt that night was so fierce it almost hurt. College changed him gradually, the way desert wind. erodes stone. At first, the changes seemed natural. He spoke differently, using words I had to look up later. He dressed better, favoring polo shirts and expensive sneakers that he claimed were necessary for networking. He made friends whose parents were doctors and lawyers, kids who vacationed in Europe and spoke casually about trust funds. I was proud of his ambition. When he called to tell me about internships at financial firms, about professors who were impressed with his potential, about opportunities that could lead to six-figure salaries, I encouraged him. This was what we'd worked for. This was the American dream actualizing in real time. But somewhere between his sophomore and junior years, Marcus began to sound embarrassed when he talked about home. He stopped mentioning our old neighborhood, stopped bringing friends around when he visited. When I asked about his social life, he grew vague. When I offered to visit campus, he made excuses about being too busy with studies. I told myself this was normal. He was growing up, finding his own identity. It was healthy for him to establish independence. I was just being a typical worrying mother. The first real warning sign came during his senior year. Marcus called me on a Wednesday evening, his voice tight with excitement. He'd been accepted into a master's program in business administration, one of the most prestigious in the country. The tuition was $60,000 per year. He spoke about it like it was already decided, like the money would materialize from thin air. I sat at my kitchen table, staring at the stack of bills I'd been sorting, and felt my stomach drop. My savings account held exactly $4,000. I was 58 years old with no retirement fund, no investments, no safety net beyond Social Security that was still years away. But when I heard the hope in Marcus's voice, the way he described the connections he'd make and the doors this degree would open, I couldn't bring myself to disappoint him. Not after everything we'd accomplished together. I took out loans. I mortgaged my future against his. I picked up a third job cleaning houses on Sundays, my knees screaming as I scrubbed bathrooms for women who were younger than me but could afford housekeepers. I sold my mother's jewelry, the few pieces she'd managed to keep when they fled Mexico. I cashed out the small life insurance policy my parents had left me. For 2 years, I funded Marcus's graduate education. I sent him money for rent, for food, for the business suits he needed for interviews. When he called to say he'd landed a position at a hedge fund in San Francisco, starting at $90,000 per year, I wept with relief. We'd done it. Every sacrifice had been worth it. Marcus moved to California and rented an apartment, in a building with a doorman. He bought a car, a sleek silver BMW that cost more than I'd made in any single year of my life. He sent me photos of his new office, of client dinners at restaurants where appetizers cost $40. His success felt like my success, vindication for every choice I'd made. But something else changed too. The phone calls became less frequent. When we did talk, Marcus sounded distracted, impatient. He complained about his commute, his workload, his demanding boss. When I shared news about my own life, about the diner finally giving me health insurance or about Mrs. Nguyen next door teaching me to garden, he responded with polite disinterest. I made excuses for his distance. He was building a career, establishing himself in a competitive field. The financial world was cutthroat and demanding. Of course he was stressed. Of course he had less time for long conversations about nothing important. The excuses became harder to maintain when Marcus started dating someone. Her name was Victoria, and from what I could piece together from his brief mentions, she came from money. Old money. The kind that built wings on university, libraries, and had streets named after ancestors. Marcus never offered to bring her home to meet me. When I suggested visiting San Francisco to see his new life, he said it wasn't a good time. I felt the first real crack in my heart during that conversation. Not because he was dating someone new, but because of how he spoke about his background when I asked if Victoria knew about our family. He said he'd told her his mother lived quietly in Southern California, that she was private and preferred not to travel. He made me sound like a recluse by choice rather than a woman who couldn't afford plane tickets. Still, I forgave him. Love makes fools of us all, but especially mothers. I told myself he was protecting me from a world where I might feel out of place. I told myself his success was justification enough for the distance growing between us. The second crack came when Marcus announced his engagement. Not in a phone call, not in a personal conversation, but through a Facebook post I saw while checking the account I rarely used. The photo showed Marcus and Victoria on a beach somewhere tropical, her manicured hand extended to display a diamond ring that probably cost more than my annual salary. The caption read, "She said yes, can't wait to start our new adventure together." I stared at that post for 20 minutes, waiting for the phone to ring, waiting for my son to call and share the news personally. The call never came. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. When I finally reached out to congratulate him, Marcus sounded surprised that I'd seen the announcement. He'd forgotten I was on social media, he said. He'd meant to call me first. The wedding planning began immediately, and with it came a series of conversations that slowly revealed how far Marcus had drifted from the world we'd once shared. The ceremony would be in Napa Valley at Victoria's family vineyard. The guest list was limited to close family and friends. When I asked about my invitation, Marcus paused for so long I thought the call had dropped. He said he wanted me there. Of course he did, but the wedding was going to be small and formal. Victoria's family had certain expectations about the guest list, about maintaining the intimacy of the occasion. He would cover my travel expenses, he assured me, but he hoped I understood that this wasn't the kind of casual celebration where extended family could bring dates or children. I understood what he wasn't saying. I was an embarrassment. My presence would remind everyone, including Victoria's sophisticated family, that Marcus came from humble beginnings, that his mother was a 60-year-old waitress who lived in a rental apartment and shopped at thrift stores. The invitation arrived 3 weeks before the wedding, a heavy cardstock affair with elegant calligraphy and tissue paper inserts. It was addressed to Ms. Connie Rivera, no guest. The RSVP card had already been filled out in Marcus's handwriting. One attendee. No dietary restrictions, no special accommodations needed. I bought a dress for the occasion, spending more than I'd ever spent on clothing in my life. I had my hair done at a real salon instead of the discount chain where I usually went. I practiced small talk in the mirror, imagining conversations with Victoria's family about topics I knew nothing about. Art, travel, wine regions, investment strategies. But as the wedding date approached, Marcus's calls became even less frequent. When I did reach him, he sounded overwhelmed, stressed about details I couldn't help with. Flowers, photographers, catering menus for guests whose names I didn't recognize. I felt like an outsider preparing to attend a stranger's celebration. 3 days before the wedding, Marcus called with news that made my heart sink even further. Victoria's grandmother, a woman who'd apparently been too ill to travel, had suddenly improved and would be attending after all. This meant they were short on seating at the main reception. Marcus wondered if I would mind sitting with the vendors' families during the dinner portion of the evening. It would only be for an hour or two, he said, and I'd still be part of all. The important moments. I agreed because I didn't know how to refuse, because despite everything, Marcus was still my son, and this was still his wedding day. Because I'd already bought the dress and arranged for someone to cover my shifts at the diner. But that night, lying in my small bedroom, listening to the neighbors arguing through the thin walls, I felt something shift inside me. Not heartbreak, exactly, but recognition. I was no longer a participant in Marcus's life. I was a footnote, an obligation, a reminder of a past he was actively trying to rewrite. The woman who had raised him, sacrificed for him, believed in him when no one else did, had become an inconvenience to be managed rather than a mother to be honored. I should have seen what was coming, should have recognized that the boy who Could relocate his own mother to the vendor's table at his wedding was capable of much worse. But hope dies hard, especially the hope that connects a mother to her child. I had no idea that in less than a week, I'd be standing in a desert gas station, watching that same son drive away without a backward glance, leaving me to face the consequences of trusting him with more than just my heart. The morning of the wedding, I drove the 4 hours to Napa Valley in my 15-year-old Honda, the same car I'd been driving since Marcus was in high school. The vineyard was stunning. All rolling hills and manicured lawns, with white tents and crystal chandeliers that caught the morning light like captured stars. I felt underdressed despite my new outfit, overwhelmed by the casual wealth on display around every corner. Victoria's family had clearly spared no expense. There were ice sculptures and a string quartet, servers in crisp white uniforms carrying silver trays of appetizers I couldn't pronounce. The other guests looked like they'd stepped from the pages of a magazine, all designer clothing and confident postures that spoke of lives lived without financial worry. I found my assigned seat during the cocktail hour and realized with a flush of embarrassment that Marcus hadn't been exaggerating about the vendor's table. I was seated with the photographer's assistant, the florist's delivery team, and a woman whose husband was apparently the backup sound technician. They were kind people, but the message was clear. This was where Marcus had decided I belonged. During the ceremony, I watched my son marry a woman I'd met exactly once, during a brief introduction that felt more like a job interview than a family meeting. Victoria was beautiful in the way that money makes possible. All perfect teeth and expensive skincare, her dress probably costing more than my annual rent. When Marcus looked at her, his face held an expression I'd never seen before. Not love exactly, but satisfaction. Like he'd acquired something valuable, something that confirmed his worth. The officiant spoke about new beginnings and chosen families, about building lives that honored both partners' dreams and aspirations. I waited for Marcus to mention our journey together, the sacrifices that had brought him to this moment, the foundation of love that had made his success possible. But when he spoke his personal vows, he talked only about the future, about the life he and Victoria would build together, the adventures they'd share, the legacy they'd create. I might as well have been invisible. The reception followed the same pattern. Marcus and Victoria made their rounds, greeting guests with practiced charm, posing for photographs with Victoria's extended family, sharing inside jokes with friends from their shared social circle. When Marcus finally made it to my table, he seemed rushed, distracted by something happening across the room. He kissed my cheek and asked if I was enjoying myself, but his eyes were already scanning the crowd for more important conversations. When I tried to tell him how proud I was, how beautiful the ceremony had been, he nodded absently and excused himself to handle some crisis with the wedding cake. I left during the dancing, slipping away while Marcus and Victoria swayed to a song I'd never heard, surrounded by guests who belonged in their world in ways I never would. The drive home was the longest 4 hours of my life, filled with a silence that felt like grief. But even then, even after being sidelined at my own son's wedding, I held on to hope that things would improve. That marriage would soften Marcus somehow, remind him of the importance of family bonds, that Victoria might encourage him to maintain connections with his roots. I was wrong about that too. The phone calls after the wedding became monthly obligations. Brief check-ins where Marcus asked about my health and I asked about his work. He and Victoria had moved to an even more expensive apartment, one with panoramic views of San Francisco Bay. They'd joined a country club, taken a honeymoon in Italy, started talking about buying a house in Marin County. Meanwhile, I was struggling more than I'd ever admitted to him. The loans I'd taken for his graduate school had variable interest rates that had increased significantly. My monthly payments now consumed nearly half my income. The diner where I'd worked for over a decade had been sold to new owners who were cutting staff and reducing hours. At 61, I was applying for jobs alongside people young enough to be my grandchildren, competing for positions that paid barely above minimum wage. I didn't tell Marcus about any of this. How could I? He was building the life we'd always dreamed of, achieving the success I'd sacrificed everything to make possible. My financial struggles would only burden him, distract him from the important work of establishing himself in his career. But the stress was wearing on me in ways I couldn't hide forever. I lost weight I couldn't afford to lose. My hair began showing more gray than black. The lines around my eyes deepened from worry and sleepless nights spent calculating bills and interest payments. When I looked in the mirror, I saw my mother's face staring back at me, worn down by a lifetime of choosing others' needs over her own. The crisis came suddenly, the way financial disasters always do. The diner closed permanently when the new owners defaulted on their lease. My unemployment benefits were a fraction of what I'd been earning. The student loan companies were unwilling to negotiate payment plans that reflected my reduced income. Within 2 months, I was facing eviction from the apartment I'd called home for 15 years. That's when I finally swallowed my pride and called Marcus for help. He listened to my situation with what sounded like genuine concern. He asked questions about my expenses, about my job search, about the timeline for finding new employment. When I finished explaining, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he said something that should have warned me about what was coming. "Mom, I think this might actually be a blessing in disguise." A blessing. My potential homelessness, my financial ruin, my complete upheaval at an age when most people were planning retirement. A blessing. Marcus had an idea, he said. He and Victoria had been talking about relocating anyway. The San Francisco housing market was overpriced, the commute was killing him, and Victoria wanted to be closer to her family on the East Coast. They'd been looking at opportunities in Boston, where Marcus could transition to a more prestigious firm and Victoria could finish her master's degree at Harvard. The solution was elegant, he explained. I could move to California and house-sit their apartment while they relocated. It would give me time to find work in a better job market, and it would help them by having someone trustworthy watching their place during the transition. Everyone would benefit. I should have asked more questions. Should have gotten details about timeline, about expectations, about what would happen when their lease expired. But I was desperate, and Marcus was offering a lifeline when I was drowning. Within a month, I'd given up my apartment, sold most of my furniture, and loaded my remaining possessions into my Honda for the drive to San Francisco. Marcus and Victoria had already left for Boston, leaving me keys and a list of instructions about plant care, mail forwarding, and maintenance contacts. The apartment was everything I'd imagined and nothing I'd expected. Beautiful but cold, filled with expensive furniture that looked like it belonged in a showroom rather than a home. The refrigerator was nearly empty except for condiments and a bottle of champagne. The closets held clothes with designer labels and price tags that would have covered my rent for months. I felt like an intruder in my son's life, surrounded by evidence of a wealth and sophistication I'd never be able to achieve myself. But I was grateful for the shelter, for the breathing room to figure out my next steps. The job search in San Francisco was brutal. Despite the supposedly robust economy, employers weren't interested in hiring a 61-year-old woman with decades of restaurant experience, but no college degree. The few interviews I managed were humiliating exercises in age discrimination disguised as skills assessment. Younger candidates with sparse resumes were chosen over me time and again. Marcus called occasionally from Boston, always sounding rushed and distracted. His new job was demanding but promising, he said. Victoria was thriving in her graduate program. They were looking at houses in Cambridge, places with character and good school districts for the future. When I mentioned my struggles finding work, Marcus offered vague encouragement about persistence and maintaining a positive attitude. When I asked about the timeline for their return to San Francisco, he grew evasive. They were still figuring things out, he said. Nothing was set in stone. It took 3 months for me to understand what was really happening. The apartment lease was in Marcus's name, but he'd been planning to break it long before I arrived. He'd used my presence as a way to avoid penalties and cleaning fees while they established themselves on the opposite coast. I wasn't house-sitting. I was providing free security and maintenance for a property he'd already abandoned. The realization came when I received a notice from the building management about lease termination. Marcus had given 60 days' notice to vacate, effective at the end of the month. The notice was addressed to him, but a copy had been sent to the current occupant, me. When I called Marcus in a panic, he sounded genuinely surprised that I hadn't understood the temporary nature of the arrangement. He thought he'd been clear about the timeline, he said. He'd assumed I would have found work and made other living arrangements by now. The conversation that followed revealed the depth of his indifference to my situation. He couldn't help with deposits for a new apartment because he and Victoria were stretched thin with their own moving expenses. He couldn't co-sign a lease because his credit was tied up in mortgage pre-approval processes. He couldn't send money because they were living paycheck to paycheck while adjusting to Boston's cost of living. Every excuse sounded reasonable in isolation, but together they painted a picture of a man who had solved his own problems by creating mine. That's when he suggested the desert. Marcus had been researching investment properties, he said, looking for opportunities in emerging markets outside major metropolitan areas. He'd found something intriguing in Nevada, a small town called Bitter Springs where land was cheap and tourism was supposedly growing. There was a business for sale, a combination gas station and convenience store on the main highway between Las Vegas and Reno. The opportunity was perfect for someone like me, he explained. Low overhead, steady traffic from travelers, the kind of simple business I could run successfully with my customer service experience. The current owner was motivated to sell quickly due to health issues. The price was incredibly reasonable, well within the range of what I could afford with a small business loan. Marcus had already done the preliminary research, he said. He'd spoken with the owner, reviewed the financial records, even driven out to see the property during a weekend trip to Las Vegas. Everything checked out. The numbers made sense. This could be my chance to start over, to build something of my own instead of depending on employers who couldn't see past my age. The more he talked, the more convinced he sounded that this was the solution to all my problems. I could have independence, financial stability, and the satisfaction of owning my own business. All I needed to do was trust him enough to let him help me make it happen. I wanted to believe him because the alternative was admitting that my son, the boy I'd raised and sacrificed for, was essentially abandoning me. I wanted to believe that his enthusiasm was genuine, that he'd found a way for both of us to win. But there was something in his voice, something too smooth and rehearsed, that made me wonder if he'd been planning this conversation for longer than he was admitting. Still, what choice did I have? I was days away from homelessness, unemployed, in one of the most expensive cities in the country, with no savings and no family besides Marcus to turn to for help. When he offered to drive me to Nevada to see the property himself, to be there for the negotiations and paperwork, I felt a surge of hope that maybe I'd been wrong about his motives. Maybe this really was his way of helping me build a better life. I should have trusted my instincts instead of my desperate need to believe in my son's love. The drive to Nevada started with promise. Marcus picked me up in his BMW on a sunny Thursday morning, the back seat loaded with my remaining possessions and a small cooler Victoria had packed with sandwiches for the road. He seemed genuinely excited about the adventure, talking enthusiastically about the potential I'd have as a business owner, the freedom of being my own boss. He'd brought a folder full of information about Bitter Springs and the gas station, complete with printed emails from the current owner and financial projections he'd calculated himself. Everything looked legitimate, professional, hopeful. Marcus had even researched the best banks in the area for small business loans and had scheduled an appointment for the following morning. The desert landscape was stunning in ways I hadn't expected. Rolling hills covered in sagebrush and Joshua trees, mountains rising in the distance like ancient monuments, sky so vast and blue it made you feel small and infinite at the same time. Marcus talked about the therapeutic value of wide-open spaces, about how different my life could be away from the noise and competition of big cities. He was being the son I remembered from years past, attentive and caring, invested in my future in ways that felt genuine. For the first time in months, I began to relax. Maybe this really was an opportunity. Maybe Marcus really was trying to help me find a path forward. Bitter Springs turned out to be smaller than I'd imagined. Just a cluster of buildings along Highway 95 with a population that couldn't have exceeded 300 people. The gas station sat at the edge of town, a modest building with 2 pumps, and a convenience store that looked tired but functional. The current owner, a man named Earl who appeared to be in his 70s, greeted us with enthusiasm that seemed a bit too eager. Earl walked us through the property, explaining the daily operations, the supplier relationships, the customer patterns he'd observed over 15 years of ownership. The numbers he quoted matched what Marcus had shown me, and his eagerness to sell was explained by a recent heart attack that had convinced him to prioritize his health over his business. Everything seemed reasonable until I started asking detailed questions about expenses, about seasonal fluctuations in business, about the actual profit margins after accounting for inventory and overhead. Earl's answers became increasingly vague, and I noticed Marcus jumping in to redirect conversations whenever I pressed for specifics. That night, in the motel where we'd booked adjoining rooms, I told Marcus I wanted to spend another day reviewing the financial records before making any commitments. The decision felt too rushed, too important to make without careful consideration. Marcus's reaction was swift and surprising. He became agitated, almost angry, insisting that Earl had other interested buyers and wouldn't hold the property indefinitely. This was a limited-time opportunity, he said. If I waited too long, I'd lose my chance at independence and end up back where I started, dependent on others for survival. His urgency felt manufactured, pressured in ways that made me uncomfortable. When I suggested we return to San Francisco so I could think things over properly, Marcus accused me of being indecisive, of sabotaging my own future out of fear. The argument that followed was unlike any conversation we'd ever had. Marcus spoke to me with a condescension that was shocking in its cruelty. He said I'd spent my entire life making small, safe choices that had kept me trapped in poverty. He said I'd never taken real risks or pursued real opportunities, which was why I was 61 years old with nothing to show for decades of work. He said Victoria had warned him that I might not have the courage to seize this chance, that women from my generation were too set in their ways to adapt to new challenges. The words hit like physical blows, not just because of their harshness, but because of the calculated way Marcus delivered them. This wasn't anger speaking. This was manipulation. He was using my insecurities and fears to pressure me into a decision that served his purposes more than mine. But I was trapped. Literally. Trapped, hundreds of miles from anywhere I could afford to live, dependent on Marcus for transportation back to civilization. I had $17 in my wallet and a maxed-out credit card. The lease on the San Francisco apartment expired in 3 days, and I had nowhere else to go. In the morning, feeling cornered and desperate, I signed the papers to buy Earl's gas station. The closing process took most of the day, with Marcus handling details I didn't understand while I sat in lawyers' offices signing documents that would determine the rest of my life. The small business loan came through a bank that seemed suspiciously eager to lend money to an unemployed woman with no collateral, and the terms included interest rates that made my stomach clench. But Marcus assured me the numbers would work. The gas station would generate enough income to cover the loan payments and provide me with a modest living. Earl would stay for a week to train me on the systems and introduce me to the regular customers. Everything would be fine. By evening, I was the owner of Desert Oasis Gas & Go, along with the small apartment above the store that would serve as my new home. Marcus helped me move my belongings upstairs, and we shared a quiet dinner at the town's only restaurant, a diner that made Rico's look sophisticated by comparison. Marcus seemed relieved that the transaction was complete, more relaxed than he'd been since we'd arrived. He talked about visiting regularly, about helping me establish the business, about how proud he was that I'd found the courage to start over. I wanted to believe him. I needed to believe him, because the alternative was accepting that my son had manipulated me into isolation, had used my desperation to solve a problem I didn't fully understand yet. The next morning, Marcus loaded his overnight bag into the BMW and prepared to drive back to Boston. He hugged me goodbye in front of the gas station, promising to call once he got home, reminding me that Earl would be there for another week to help with the transition. I watched his car disappear down Highway 95, heading east toward the life he'd built without me, and felt the first real stirring of doubt about what I'd agreed to. But I pushed the feeling down, focusing instead on the tasks ahead. I had a business to learn, a new life to build, a chance to prove that Marcus had been right about my potential for independence. It took exactly 3 days for the truth to surface. Earl's week of training lasted exactly 3 days before he received a sudden call about a family emergency that required his immediate departure. He left me with a hastily scribbled list of supplier phone numbers and instructions that assumed I already understood the basics of running a gas station. Within hours of his departure, I realized how thoroughly I'd been deceived. The financial records Earl had shown us were fabricated, designed to make the business appear profitable when it was actually hemorrhaging money. The supplier relationships he'd described were either non-existent or severely strained due to unpaid invoices. The regular customers he'd mentioned were mostly local residents who rarely purchased more than a few dollars worth of gas or convenience items. The worst discovery came when I tried to access the business bank account Earl had supposedly established for inventory purchases. The account existed, but it contained exactly $43. The previous week's sales, which should have generated several $100s according to Earl's projections, had been deposited and immediately withdrawn, leaving me with no operating capital. I called Marcus in a panic, explaining what I'd discovered, begging him to help me understand how everything had gone so wrong so quickly. His response was a masterclass in deflection and manipulation. He expressed surprise and concern about Earl's deception, insisting that all the information had seemed legitimate when he'd researched the opportunity. He suggested that Earl must have altered the records after their initial conversations, taking advantage of our trust and enthusiasm. When I asked him to help me explore legal options for reversing the sale, Marcus became evasive. He wasn't a lawyer, he said. He didn't understand business law well enough to offer advice. I should consult with local attorneys who specialized in these kinds of disputes. When I reminded him that I had no money to hire lawyers, Marcus grew impatient. He'd done his best to help me find an opportunity, he said. The fact that Earl had been dishonest wasn't Marcus's fault. I was an adult who had made her own decisions based on information that had seemed reliable at the time. He was sorry things weren't working out as planned, but he couldn't take responsibility for other people's deceptions. The conversation ended with Marcus suggesting I give the business more time before making any drastic decisions. Maybe things would improve once I learned the systems better. Maybe I could find ways to increase revenue that Earl hadn't explored. He had to go, he said. Victoria was calling him for dinner. That night, alone in the small apartment above a failing gas station in the middle of the Nevada desert, I finally understood what had happened to me. Marcus hadn't been helping me find independence. He'd been solving his own problem. The apartment lease in San Francisco, the guilt over abandoning his mother, the inconvenience of my financial crisis interfering with his new life. I had been a complication that needed to be managed. The gas station was never meant to succeed. It was meant to relocate me far enough away that my struggles wouldn't reflect poorly on Marcus's carefully constructed image. Whether I thrived or failed in Bitter Springs was irrelevant as long as I was no longer his responsibility. But what Marcus didn't understand, what he'd never bothered to learn about the woman who'd raised him, was that I hadn't survived 61 years of hardship by giving up when things got difficult. If he thought isolation would break me, he was wrong. If he thought I'd disappear quietly into the desert, he was mistaken. And if he thought his bank account was safe from the consequences of abandoning his mother, he was about to learn exactly how dangerous it could be to underestimate. Connie Rivera. The first week at Desert Oasis was a crash course in survival that made my years as a single mother look easy by comparison. Every system Earl had supposedly maintained was either broken or non-existent. The cash register dated from the 1990s and randomly deleted transactions. The refrigeration unit for drinks leaked constantly, creating puddles that made the floor treacherous. The gas pumps worked sporadically, sometimes requiring customers to try multiple times before successfully fueling their vehicles. But the worst part wasn't the failing equipment. It was the crushing loneliness of 18-hour days with almost no human interaction. Bitter Springs wasn't on the main tourist route between major cities. Most of my customers were locals buying lottery tickets and energy drinks, people who viewed me with the polite suspicion small towns reserve for outsiders who might not stay long enough to matter. I learned to fix minor problems myself because calling repair services meant paying travel fees that exceeded my daily revenue. I taught myself basic plumbing when the bathroom sink started backing up. I figured out how to reset circuit breakers when the ancient electrical system overloaded. I negotiated payment plans with suppliers who were threatening to cut off deliveries due to Earl's unpaid invoices. Every night I climbed the narrow stairs to my apartment above the store, my body aching from standing on concrete floors for 16 hours straight. The apartment was a study in minimalism born of necessity. A single room with a kitchenette, a bed that folded down from the wall, and a window that looked out over an endless expanse of desert that seemed to stretch beyond the curve of the earth itself. The silence was the hardest part to adjust to. After decades of living in apartments where neighbors' televisions bled through thin walls and traffic provided a constant urban lullaby, the desert quiet felt oppressive. At night, lying in the narrow bed, I could hear my own heartbeat and the settling groans of the building cooling from the day's heat. But gradually, something unexpected began to happen. The overwhelming fear that had consumed me during those first days started to transform into something else. Not peace exactly, but acceptance. Not happiness, but a grim determination that surprised me with its strength. I had been abandoned by the one person I'd trusted most in the world, stranded in a place where I knew no one, burdened with debt that seemed impossible to overcome. By any reasonable measure, I should have been broken. Instead, I discovered reserves of resilience I hadn't known I possessed. The business was failing, but it wasn't dead yet. I began keeping meticulous records of every transaction, every expense, every pattern I could identify in the sparse customer traffic. I learned that truckers traveling overnight routes often stopped for coffee and snacks between midnight and dawn. I started staying open 24 hours, brewing fresh coffee every few hours and stocking the kind of high-caffeine energy drinks and protein bars that long-haul drivers preferred. Local residents began warming to me gradually. Mrs. Chen, who owned the Chinese restaurant down the street, started stopping by for cigarettes and awkward conversation about the weather. Tommy Reeves, a mechanic whose shop was across the highway, took pity on me and showed me how to perform basic maintenance on the gas pumps. Sarah Martinez, the town librarian, became my first real friend, bringing me books and offering practical advice about navigating small-town politics. These relationships developed slowly, built on small kindnesses and mutual respect rather than the instant intimacy I'd been accustomed to in cities where people shared too much too quickly. But they were genuine in ways that surprised me. When the refrigeration unit finally died completely, Tommy and two of his friends showed up with tools and replacement parts, refusing payment beyond a case of beer and my promise to let Sarah teach me to play bridge. I was learning to live differently, to find satisfaction in smaller victories. Successfully negotiating a payment plan with the beverage distributor felt like a major accomplishment. Convincing a traveling salesman to stock my shelves with higher margin items gave me the same pride I'd once felt watching Marcus receive academic awards. The financial reality remained brutal. Even with my modest improvements, the gas station generated barely enough revenue to cover basic operating expenses. The loan payments consumed most of what little profit I managed to create. I was living on canned soup and peanut butter sandwiches, rationing everything from toilet paper to laundry detergent. But I was surviving. More than surviving, I was adapting. Every morning I woke up and opened the store. Every evening I counted the day's receipts and planned for tomorrow. Every week I made another small improvement to the business or learned another skill that made me less dependent on outside help. Marcus called exactly once during my first month in Bitter Springs. The conversation was brief and awkward, filled with his questions about how things were going and my carefully neutral responses that revealed nothing about my struggles. He seemed relieved when I assured him everything was fine, that I was adjusting well to small-town life. I didn't tell him about the refrigeration breakdown or the supplier issues or the long nights when I sat at the kitchen table calculating whether I could afford to keep the lights on for another month. I didn't mention the loneliness or the physical exhaustion or the growing realization that he'd essentially sold me into a form of exile disguised as opportunity. Instead, I let him believe his plan had worked perfectly. His mother was safely tucked away in the Nevada desert, no longer a complication in his carefully curated life. He could focus on his marriage and career without worrying about phone calls, requesting financial help or visits that might embarrass him in front of Victoria's sophisticated friends. What Marcus didn't understand was that his silence spoke louder than any words could have. The son who'd once called me his best friend now checked on me with the same casual attention he might give to a houseplant. Our relationship had become a monthly obligation, a brief interruption in his busy schedule, but I was learning something important about myself during those long desert days. The woman who'd spent 34 years defining herself as Marcus's mother was discovering she had other identities worth exploring. I was Connie Rivera, business owner. Connie Rivera, member of the Bitter Springs community. Connie Rivera, survivor of circumstances that would have broken someone with less determination. The desert was teaching me lessons I'd never learned in all my years of urban living. Patience, for one thing. In the city, everything moved at a frantic pace that demanded immediate responses and instant solutions. Here, problems were solved gradually, through persistence rather than urgency. Relationships developed slowly, but lasted longer. Success was measured in small increments rather than dramatic breakthroughs. I was also learning about the strange mathematics of minimalism. With so few possessions and such limited income, every decision carried weight. Buying a new pair of shoes meant sacrificing something else. Choosing to stock one brand of snacks over another could affect the week's profitability. This forced attention to detail taught me things about value and priority that I'd never had to consider when money was merely tight, rather than truly scarce. 3 months into my desert exile, I received an unexpected visitor. Sarah Martinez knocked on my door one evening after closing, holding a manila envelope and wearing an expression that mixed excitement with concern. She'd been researching something for me, she said, using her librarian skills to investigate questions I'd never thought to ask. The envelope contained copies of public records related to Desert Oasis Gas and Go, documents that revealed a pattern of ownership changes and financial manipulations that went back several years. Earl hadn't been the long-term owner he'd claimed to be. He'd purchased the business just 8 months before selling it to me, and he'd bought it under similar circumstances from another desperate individual who'd been convinced it represented a profitable opportunity. The previous owner before that had lasted only 14 months. According to Sarah's research, someone had been systematically using Desert Oasis as a vehicle for what appeared to be a sophisticated investment fraud. The business was purchased by individuals who had limited resources and high motivation, operated long enough to generate modest cash flow, then resold to the next victim while debts and operational problems accumulated. The most disturbing discovery was a series of classified advertisements that had appeared in various newspapers over the past 3 years, all promoting investment opportunities in emerging desert markets and undervalued highway businesses with proven revenue streams. The contact information on these ads led to a Las Vegas post office box registered under a business name that didn't appear in any legitimate corporate databases. As Sarah walked me through the documentation, I felt a familiar sensation in my stomach, the same sick recognition I'd experienced when I first realized how thoroughly Marcus had manipulated my relocation to San Francisco. I wasn't just a victim of Earl's individual deception. I was part of a larger scheme that had been designed to exploit people exactly like me. People who were financially desperate, geographically displaced, and emotionally vulnerable to promises of independence and fresh starts. The question that haunted me as I reviewed Sarah's findings was how Marcus had discovered this particular opportunity. Had he simply been an innocent victim of sophisticated marketing, genuinely believing he was helping me find legitimate business ownership? Or had he known exactly what he was steering me toward? I wanted to believe in his innocence, but the evidence suggested otherwise. The Las Vegas post office box was registered to an address less than 5 miles from the hotel where Marcus and Victoria had stayed during their supposed research trip. The timing of his contact with Earl coincided perfectly with a fresh round of classified advertisements promoting desert investment opportunities. Most damning of all was a detail Sarah had uncovered through her connections with the Nevada Department of Business Registration. The business license for Desert Oasis had been renewed just 2 weeks before my purchase, and the renewal fee had been paid by a cashier's check issued by a Las Vegas bank on the same day Marcus had claimed to be visiting the property for the first time. My son hadn't just stumbled across this opportunity. He'd been actively involved in setting up my exploitation. The realization hit me like a physical blow, not because I was shocked by Marcus's betrayal. I'd already accepted that. He'd manipulated me into this situation, but because I finally understood the calculated nature of his cruelty. This wasn't a misguided attempt to help me find independence. This was a deliberate effort to make me disappear. Marcus had researched investment fraud schemes specifically to find a way to relocate me as far as possible from his new life. He'd paid money to ensure I'd be trapped in a failing business with enough debt to prevent me from leaving. He'd collaborated with criminals to eliminate the inconvenience of having a working-class mother who might embarrass him in front of his wealthy in-laws. That night, I sat in my tiny apartment above the gas station, surrounded by Sarah's research, and feeling the full weight of my son's betrayal settle into my bones. The boy I'd raised, sacrificed for, and loved unconditionally, had sold me to strangers like unwanted furniture. But instead of the overwhelming despair I'd expected to feel, something else began building inside me. Not rage exactly, though there was certainly anger. Not revenge, though the desire for justice was definitely present. What I felt was a cold, clear determination that surprised me with its intensity. Marcus had underestimated me. He'd assumed that isolating me in the desert would render me powerless, that financial desperation would keep me focused on mere survival rather than investigation or retaliation. He'd counted on my love for him to prevent me from looking too closely at how I'd ended up in this situation. But he'd made a crucial miscalculation. The woman he'd abandoned in Bitter Springs wasn't the same woman who'd raised him in Riverside. 34 years of motherhood had taught me to put others' needs before my own, to absorb disappointment quietly, to make excuses for people I loved even when they hurt me. The desert was teaching me different lessons, about self-reliance and calculated decision-making, about the difference between being alone and being independent, about the power that comes from having nothing left to lose. Marcus had given me an unexpected gift by stranding me here. He'd forced me to discover strengths I'd never needed to develop, skills I'd never had to learn, and a sense of my own worth that wasn't dependent on other people's approval or affection. Now, I was going to return that gift, with interest. The next morning, I called the Las Vegas Police Department and filed a complaint about investment fraud. I provided Sarah's research, my purchase documents, and a detailed timeline of how I'd been recruited for the scheme. The detective I spoke with seemed unsurprised by my story, mentioning that they'd received similar reports over the past 2 years, but had struggled to build cases because most victims were too embarrassed or financially devastated to cooperate fully with investigations. I also contacted an attorney Sarah recommended, a woman named Diana Foster who specialized in consumer protection cases and had experience with investment fraud litigation. Diana agreed to review my situation for a modest consultation fee that I could barely afford but considered essential. The legal consultation revealed both good news and bad news. The good news was that I had legitimate grounds for both civil and criminal complaints against the investment fraud network. The documentation Sarah had uncovered, combined with my purchase records and the pattern of previous victims, created a strong foundation for legal action. The bad news was that recovering my losses would be difficult and time-consuming. The criminals behind the scheme had structured their operations to make asset recovery nearly impossible. Money moved through multiple accounts and shell companies, before disappearing into investments that couldn't be traced or seized. Even if I won civil judgments against Earl and his associates, they likely had no assets available for collection. The fraud was designed to generate quick profits that were immediately moved beyond the reach of victims and law enforcement. However, Diana explained, there was one aspect of my case that made it unusual and potentially more promising than typical investment fraud situations. Most victims had been recruited through anonymous classified advertisements and had no direct connection to the perpetrators beyond the fraudulent business transactions. My case was different because Marcus had been directly involved in the scheme, and unlike Earl and his criminal associates, Marcus had legitimate assets and income that could be subject to civil liability. If I could prove that Marcus had knowingly participated in defrauding me rather than simply being an innocent intermediary, I might be able to recover damages from him personally. This possibility opened up investigative avenues that hadn't existed for previous victims. Diana could subpoena Marcus's financial records, phone records, and travel expenses to establish the timeline and nature of his involvement. She could depose him under oath about his relationship with Earl and his knowledge of the investment fraud scheme. Most importantly, she could explore whether Marcus had received any compensation for recruiting me as a victim, which would transform his actions from misguided family intervention to active participation in criminal conspiracy. The prospect of legally challenging Marcus filled me with a mixture of anticipation and sadness that surprised me with its complexity. Part of me still wanted to believe that my son had been manipulated just as I had been, that his cruelty was born of weakness rather than calculation. But another part of me, the part that had been growing stronger during my months in the desert, knew that I couldn't allow sentiment to prevent me from seeking justice. Marcus had made choices that had devastated my life, and those choices needed to have consequences regardless of our family relationship. I authorized Diana to begin preliminary investigations into Marcus's involvement in the investment fraud scheme. The retainer fee consumed my entire savings account and meant I'd be living on an even tighter budget for the foreseeable future, but I considered it an investment in my own dignity. While Diana worked on the legal aspects of my case, I focused on improving the gas station's operations and building my life in Bitter Springs. The knowledge that I was actively fighting back against the people who'd victimized me gave me energy I hadn't felt in months. I started advertising the 24-hour coffee service to trucking companies that scheduled routes through southern Nevada. I negotiated better wholesale prices by coordinating with other small business owners in town to make group purchases of common supplies. I even convinced the local Chamber of Commerce to include Desert Oasis in their tourism materials as an authentic desert experience for travelers seeking alternatives to chain establishments. These improvements were modest but measurable. Daily revenue increased by nearly 30% over the course of 6 weeks. More importantly, I was building relationships with suppliers and customers that gave the business a foundation for long-term sustainability rather than day-to-day survival. Tommy Reeves started bringing his mechanic customers to buy snacks and drinks while their cars were being serviced. Sarah Martinez organized a weekly book club that met in the gas station after hours. Bringing in regular customers who purchased coffee and pastries, I'd started making myself using my grandmother's recipes. Mrs. Chen and I developed a symbiotic relationship where I sold her restaurant's takeout containers in my convenience store, and she recommended my gas station to her customers who needed fuel. These small collaborations created a sense of community investment in my success that felt more valuable than any business loan. I was discovering that the skills I'd developed as a single mother, the ability to stretch resources, to build relationships through service, to persist through difficulties that seemed overwhelming, translated remarkably well to small business ownership. The same determination that had gotten Marcus through college was now helping me build something sustainable from the ruins of what had been intended as my disposal. 3 months after beginning legal proceedings, Diana called with news that changed everything. Her investigation had uncovered financial records showing that Marcus had received a payment of $15,000 from a Las Vegas business account registered to the same network that had been running the investment fraud scheme. The payment had been made 2 weeks after my purchase of Desert Oasis, disguised as a consulting fee for market research and client development services. Diana had also discovered that Marcus had made 3 separate trips to Las Vegas over the 6 months preceding my relocation, all paid for with credit cards that showed charges at hotels, restaurants, and entertainment venues that suggested meetings rather than simple tourism. Most damning of all was a series of phone records showing extensive communication between Marcus and known associates of the investment fraud network, including calls made during the time period when he was supposedly researching legitimate business opportunities on my behalf. The evidence painted a clear picture of deliberate conspiracy rather than innocent mistake. Marcus hadn't stumbled across the Desert Oasis opportunity while trying to help me find independence. He'd been recruited as a participant in the fraud scheme, paid to identify and deliver vulnerable victims who could be exploited for maximum profit. My son had literally sold me to criminals for $15,000. The depth of his betrayal was stunning even to someone who'd already accepted that he'd manipulated me into exile. Marcus hadn't just been willing to let me suffer for his convenience. He'd profited from my suffering. He'd turned my desperation into his financial gain while maintaining the pretense of concerned family assistance. Diana explained that this evidence transformed my case from a difficult civil claim into a strong criminal referral and a virtually certain civil judgment. Marcus's direct participation in the fraud scheme made him liable not only for my actual losses but potentially for punitive damages as well. More immediately, the evidence provided grounds for asset preservation orders that could freeze Marcus's accounts and prevent him from hiding money before final judgments were entered. Diana could also seek emergency support payments to help cover my living expenses while the case progressed through the courts. But before taking any of these steps, Diana wanted to give Marcus an opportunity to resolve the matter voluntarily. She proposed sending him a detailed demand letter outlining the evidence against him and offering to settle the case privately in exchange for full restitution of my losses, plus reasonable compensation for the hardship he'd caused. The settlement demand would include repayment of all money I'd lost on the Desert Oasis purchase, compensation for my living expenses during the period of exploitation, and enough additional funds to allow me to relocate and rebuild my life if I chose to leave. Bitter Springs. If Marcus refused to negotiate or attempted to deny his involvement, Diana would immediately file criminal complaints and begin aggressive civil litigation that would expose his participation in investment fraud to his employers, his wife's family, and anyone else who chose to research the public court records. I had mixed feelings about offering Marcus a chance to settle privately. Part of me wanted him to face public consequences for what he'd done, to have his carefully constructed image shattered by exposure of his criminal behavior. But another part of me, the practical part that had learned to prioritize survival over satisfaction, recognized that a negotiated settlement would provide faster relief and more certain recovery than a prolonged legal battle. More importantly, the settlement offer would test whether Marcus retained any capacity for remorse or family loyalty. His response would reveal definitively whether the son I'd raised still existed somewhere beneath the callous stranger he'd become. Diana mailed the demand letter on a Tuesday afternoon, sending it by certified mail to both Marcus's work address and his home in Cambridge. The letter detailed his involvement in the investment fraud scheme, outlined the evidence documenting his participation, and demanded a response within 14 days. Now all I had to do was wait to learn who my son really was. The waiting period stretched like an eternity compressed into 2 weeks. Every morning, I opened Desert Oasis and tried to focus on serving customers and managing inventory, but my mind kept drifting to imagined scenarios of how Marcus might respond to Diana's letter. Would he call immediately, panicked and apologetic? Ready to make amends for what he'd done? Would he deny everything and force us into a legal battle that would consume months or years? Would he try to contact me directly, attempting to manipulate me into dropping the case through emotional appeals about family loyalty and forgiveness? Or would he simply ignore the letter entirely, gambling that I lacked the resources or determination to follow through on the threatened legal action? Sarah Martinez became my unofficial counselor during this period, stopping by each evening to check on my emotional state and provide the kind of steady support that felt more valuable than professional therapy. She'd lived through her own difficult divorce several years earlier and understood the strange mixture of hope and dread that comes with waiting for someone you once loved to reveal their true character. Tommy Reeves and Mrs. Chen also seemed to sense my distraction, going out of their way to include me in casual conversations that provided temporary relief from obsessive speculation about Marcus's response. The small kindnesses of my bitter Springs community reminded me daily that I'd found something here worth protecting, regardless of how the legal situation resolved itself. 8 days after Diana mailed the demand letter, my phone rang at 6:30 in the morning. The caller, ID showed Marcus's number, and my heart began racing before I even answered. His voice was tight and controlled, carefully modulated in the way that suggested he'd rehearsed this conversation multiple times before making the call. He didn't waste time on pleasantries or family small talk. He got straight to the point, with the efficiency of someone who wanted to minimize the duration of an unpleasant task. Marcus claimed he'd received a confusing legal document that seemed to contain serious misunderstandings about his role in helping me purchase the gas station. He insisted that he'd been just as deceived by Earl as I had been, that any payments he'd received had been legitimate reimbursements for travel expenses and time spent researching the investment opportunity. He said he was disappointed that I'd chosen to involve lawyers instead of discussing my concerns with him directly. Family disputes should be handled privately, he argued, not aired in legal proceedings that could damage everyone involved. Marcus offered to help me recover my losses by co-signing a loan that would allow me to purchase a different business, something more suitable to my skills and experience. He could also provide references to help me find employment in Boston if I decided that business ownership wasn't the right path forward. What he didn't offer was any acknowledgement of wrongdoing, any expression of genuine remorse, or any direct financial compensation for the hardship he'd caused. His proposed solutions all involved additional risk and obligation on my part, while absolving him of responsibility for the consequences of his actions. Most tellingly, he never asked how I was doing. Never expressed concern about my living conditions, my financial situation, or my emotional well-being after months of struggling to survive in the desert. His focus was entirely on minimizing his own liability and exposure. I listened to his carefully constructed explanation without interruption, letting him complete his narrative before responding. When he finished speaking, I was quiet for a long moment, gathering my thoughts and choosing my words carefully. Then I said something that surprised both of us with its clarity and finality. I told Marcus that I loved him, that I would always love him because he was my son, but that I no longer trusted him or respected him. His actions had revealed a capacity for cruelty that I'd never imagined existed in someone I'd raised to value compassion and integrity. I explained that Diana's investigation had uncovered evidence of his direct participation in the fraud scheme, including financial records and communications that contradicted his claims of innocent involvement. He could deny his culpability to me, but he couldn't deny it to law enforcement or civil courts that would examine the documentary evidence objectively. I gave him one more opportunity to respond honestly to Diana's settlement offer, to take responsibility for what he'd done and make appropriate restitution without forcing me to pursue criminal charges that would destroy his career and marriage. But if he continued to deny his involvement or refuse to provide fair compensation for my losses, I would authorize Diana to file both criminal complaints and civil lawsuits that would expose his behavior to public scrutiny. The choice was his, I said. He could resolve this matter quietly and preserve what remained of our relationship, or he could fight it publicly and accept the consequences of having his criminal behavior documented in court records that would follow him for the rest of his life. Then I hung up the phone before he could respond, leaving him to contemplate his options without the benefit of further manipulation or negotiation. 2 days later, Diana received a call from an attorney representing Marcus. He was prepared to discuss settlement terms that would provide full restitution for my documented losses in exchange for my agreement not to pursue criminal charges or discuss his involvement in the matter publicly. The negotiation process took another week, with lawyers arguing over the precise calculation of my damages and the terms of confidentiality agreements that would protect Marcus's reputation while ensuring my financial recovery. In the end, we reached an agreement that required Marcus to pay me $137,000 in compensation for my losses, plus an additional $50,000 to cover my legal expenses and provide cushion for rebuilding my life. The settlement also included a provision that Marcus would purchase Desert Oasis from me at a price that covered my outstanding loan obligations, freeing me from the debt burden that had trapped me in Bitter Springs. Most importantly, from my perspective, the agreement included a clause requiring Marcus to provide a written acknowledgement of his participation in the investment fraud scheme, a document that would be held by Diana but could be released to law. Enforcement if Marcus violated any terms of the settlement. Within 30 days, I received a certified check for the full settlement amount and transfer documents that officially removed my name from all obligations related to Desert Oasis gas. And go. For the first time in over a decade, I was financially secure. More than secure. I had enough money to live comfortably while deciding what I wanted to do with the rest of my life. But the money, while welcome, wasn't the most important thing I'd gained from this experience. I'd discovered that I was stronger than I'd ever imagined, more resourceful than I'd given myself credit for, and capable of building meaningful relationships even in the most unlikely circumstances. I'd also learned that justice doesn't always require courtrooms or criminal convictions. Sometimes it's enough to force someone to acknowledge the truth about what they've done and to pay an appropriate price for the harm they've caused. Marcus and I never spoke again after that final phone call. The settlement agreement was executed through attorneys, and he disappeared from my life as completely as if he'd never existed. I stayed in Bitter Springs for another 6 months, not because I had to, but because I wanted to. Sarah Martinez and Tommy Reeves and Mrs. Chen had become family in ways that mattered more than blood relationships. The desert community had offered me acceptance and support when my actual family had abandoned me. Eventually, I decided to sell my apartment above the former gas station and use my settlement money to purchase a small house in town. I opened a catering business that specialized in comfort food for local events and celebrations, using my grandmother's recipes and the customer service skills I'd developed over decades of serving others. The business thrived in ways that Desert Oasis never could have, because it was built on my own skills and interests rather than someone else's deception. I hired Sarah as my part-time bookkeeper and Tommy's daughter as weekend help, creating employment for people who'd supported me when I had nothing to offer in return. Marcus sent a single Christmas card that first year, signed only with his name, containing no personal message or acknowledgement of what had passed between us. I didn't respond, and he never contacted me again. Sometimes I wonder what his life is like now, whether he tells Victoria about the mother he abandoned in the desert, whether he's found ways to rationalize his behavior that allow him to sleep peacefully at night. But mostly, I don't think about him at all. The son I raised died the day he drove away from that gas station, leaving me stranded in the heat with $17 and no way home. The man who took his place is a stranger, whose choices and consequences are no longer my responsibility. What I think about instead is the unexpected gift he gave me by forcing me to discover who I really was beneath 34 years of self-sacrifice and unconditional love. The desert taught me that I was capable of surviving anything, that I could build meaningful relationships based on mutual respect rather than obligation, that I could create prosperity through my own efforts rather than depending on others' success. Marcus thought he was disposing of me when he left me at that gas station. Instead, he was freeing me to become the woman I was always meant to be. The transformation didn't happen overnight, but it happened completely. 6 months after the settlement was finalized, I stood in the kitchen of my new house watching the sunrise paint the desert mountains in shades of gold and crimson, and realized I couldn't remember the last time I'd felt genuinely happy. Not content, not satisfied, not merely surviving, but truly happy in a way that seemed to emanate from my bones. The house was modest by any standard except my own. 3 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, a kitchen with actual counter space, and a living room large enough for furniture that wasn't pressed against the walls. But it was mine in ways that no place had ever been before. I'd chosen every paint color, every fixture, every piece of furniture based on my own preferences, rather than budget constraints or someone else's needs. The master bedroom had windows on 2 walls that filled the space with natural light throughout the day. I'd converted the 2nd bedroom into an office where I managed my catering business, and the 3rd into a guest room that stayed ready for visitors, even though I rarely had overnight guests. The symbolism wasn't lost on me. For the first time in my adult life, I had space that existed simply because I wanted it to exist. My catering business had grown beyond anything I'd initially imagined possible. What started as a way to use my cooking skills and generate modest income had evolved into something that felt more like a calling than a job. Word spread quickly. In a small town when someone could provide excellent food at reasonable prices, and within months I was booking events throughout the region. Weddings were my specialty, though I also catered birthday parties, anniversary celebrations, corporate meetings, and funeral receptions. There was something deeply satisfying about nourishing people during their most important moments, about being trusted to handle the details that made celebrations memorable. The irony wasn't lost on me that I'd become someone who helped create perfect wedding days after being relegated to the vendor's table at my own son's ceremony. But the weddings I catered felt different from that sterile Napa Valley spectacle. These were celebrations rooted in genuine affection and community connection, rather than social performance and conspicuous consumption. Sarah Martinez had become both my business partner and my closest friend. Her organizational skills and attention to detail complemented my cooking abilities perfectly. She handled contracts, scheduling, and customer relations, while I focused on menu development and food preparation. Together, we'd built something that served our community while providing both of us with financial security and professional satisfaction. The relationship felt revolutionary after decades of friendships that had been complicated by financial imbalance or family obligations. Sarah and I were equals who chose to spend time together because we enjoyed each other's company, not because circumstances or duty required our interaction. We could disagree about business decisions without damaging our personal relationship, and we could share personal struggles without fear of judgment or unsolicited advice. Tommy Reeves had become another unexpected source of support and companionship. What started as neighborly assistance with equipment repairs had evolved into a friendship based on shared values and complementary skills. Tommy was divorced with 2 teenage daughters who lived with him half the time, and he understood the complexities of rebuilding life after betrayal by someone you'd trusted completely. We weren't romantically involved, though I suspected some of our friends hoped we might become a couple. Instead, we'd developed something more valuable, a partnership based on mutual respect and practical cooperation. Tommy handled maintenance and minor construction projects for my business in exchange for catered meals for his family and help with his daughter's school events. His younger daughter, Maria, had started working for me part-time, learning basic cooking skills and customer service while earning money for college expenses. Watching her enthusiasm for food preparation and her natural talent for hospitality reminded me of the joy I'd found in nurturing Marcus's potential, but without the crushing weight of sacrificing my own dreams for someone else's success. Mrs. Chen had also become a regular presence in my life, though our relationship remained delightfully prickly around the edges. She was in her 70s, had strong opinions about everything from proper seasoning techniques to local politics, and possessed the kind of blunt honesty that could be either refreshing or devastating depending on your perspective. But she was also fiercely loyal to people she considered family, and for reasons I'd never fully understood, she'd adopted me into that category within months of my arrival in Bitter Springs. When I was struggling with the gas station, she'd brought me containers of soup and vegetables from her restaurant without being asked. When I started my catering business, she'd recommended me to every customer who mentioned upcoming celebrations. Most importantly, Mrs. Chen had taught me something invaluable about the difference between being alone and being lonely. She lived by herself, had never married, and had no children, but she'd created a chosen family of friends and neighbors who provided companionship and support without requiring her to compromise her independence or conform to anyone else's expectations. These relationships had given me something I'd never experienced during my years of focused motherhood, a sense of belonging that wasn't dependent on caretaking or self-sacrifice. I was valued for who I was rather than what I could provide, appreciated for my skills and personality rather than my willingness to absorb other people's problems without complaint. The financial security from the settlement had been crucial in making this new life possible, but money alone couldn't have created the sense of peace and purpose I'd discovered in Bitter Springs. That had come from learning to trust my own judgment, from building relationships based on reciprocity rather than obligation, from discovering that I had value beyond my usefulness to others. I still thought about Marcus sometimes, usually triggered by news stories about successful young professionals or glimpses of mother-son relationships that reminded me of what I'd lost. The grief came in waves that were less frequent, but no less intense than they'd been immediately after our final conversation. But the grief was different now, cleaner somehow. I mourned the relationship we'd once had and the son I'd thought I was raising, but I no longer felt responsible for his choices or obligated to enable his behavior. He'd made decisions that had consequences, and those consequences belonged to him regardless of our biological connection. The settlement money had given me options I'd never had before, but it had also forced me to confront questions about what I actually wanted from life, rather than what circumstances required me to accept. For the first time since Marcus was born, I could make decisions based on my own preferences and priorities, rather than financial necessity or family obligation. I'd considered moving back to California, closer to familiar places and the few old friends who'd maintained contact over the years. I'd researched cities with better cultural amenities and more diverse populations. I'd even looked into college, programs that might allow me to pursue interests I'd abandoned decades earlier, when survival took precedence over personal fulfillment. But every exploration of alternatives only reinforced my appreciation for what I'd found in Bitter Springs. The desert landscape that had initially seemed harsh and unwelcoming now felt like home in ways that city environments never had. The sense of community, the slower pace of life, the ability to make a meaningful difference in a small place. These had become more valuable to me than urban conveniences or career opportunities. I was learning to garden in the desert climate, coaxing vegetables and herbs from soil that seemed determined to resist cultivation. The challenge appealed to the same stubborn determination that had gotten me through single motherhood and business ownership. Every tomato I harvested felt like a victory over circumstances that were supposed to be impossible to overcome. The garden also provided therapeutic benefits that surprised me with their intensity. Working with soil and plants required attention to the present moment in ways that interrupted the mental loops of regret and anxiety that had plagued me for years. Planting seeds became an act of faith in the future. Nurturing growth became a form of meditation that was more effective than any formal mindfulness practice. I'd also started volunteering at the local library, helping Sarah with community programs and literacy initiatives. The work reminded me how much I'd enjoyed learning during the brief period in my 20s when I'd taken evening classes at community college, before Marcus's needs consumed all my available time and energy. Working with adult literacy students taught me that my own educational journey hadn't ended when I dropped out of college to focus on motherhood. I had knowledge and skills accumulated through decades of life experience that were valuable to people who were struggling with challenges similar to those I'd faced myself. One of my students was a woman named Rosa, who'd immigrated from Guatemala with minimal English skills and was working to pass her citizenship exam. Her determination and optimism reminded me of my own parents' immigrant experience, and helping her navigate bureaucratic systems and cultural expectations gave me a sense of purpose that felt more meaningful than any paying job I'd ever held. Another student was a man in his 50s who'd hidden his illiteracy throughout a successful construction career, but needed to improve his reading skills to qualify for supervisory positions. His shame about educational gaps resonated with my own feelings of inadequacy in Marcus's academic environment, and watching his confidence grow as his skills improved reminded me that learning is possible at any age. These volunteer experiences were teaching me that I had gifts to offer that weren't related to cooking or caretaking. I could teach, mentor, and support others without sacrificing my own needs or enabling destructive behavior. I could be helpful without being taken advantage of, generous without being depleted. The contrast with my relationship with Marcus was stark and instructive. With my literacy students, progress was mutual. They gained skills while I gained satisfaction and purpose. Success was celebrated together, and setbacks were addressed without blame or manipulation. The relationships were bounded by clear expectations and mutual respect rather than guilt, obligation, and emotional blackmail. As the first anniversary of my settlement with Marcus approached, I found myself reflecting on the trajectory that had brought me from desperate abandonment to genuine contentment. The transformation had required facing painful truths about my son's character and my own patterns of enabling behavior, but it had also revealed strengths and possibilities I'd never known existed. I was healthier than I'd been in years, both physically and emotionally. The constant stress of financial insecurity had disappeared, but more importantly, the chronic anxiety of trying to manage someone else's choices and emotions had lifted. I slept better, laughed more easily, and felt optimistic about the future in ways that had seemed impossible when my identity was entirely wrapped up in Marcus's success and approval. My catering business was thriving beyond my initial projections. Word-of-mouth recommendations had expanded my client base to include events in Las Vegas and other larger cities, requiring me to hire additional staff and invest in professional equipment. The growth was exciting but manageable, allowing me to maintain the personal touch and quality control that had built my reputation. More significantly, the business success was entirely my own achievement. I hadn't inherited opportunities, or relied on family connections, or benefited from advantages I hadn't earned. Every client recommendation, every successful event, every positive review reflected my own skills, effort, and judgment. The pride I felt was clean and uncomplicated, untainted by awareness that someone else's sacrifices had made my accomplishments possible. I'd also started dating, tentatively and with careful attention to my own boundaries and expectations. There was a man named David who owned a small ranch outside town and occasionally hired me to cater events for his horse breeding business. He was kind, financially stable, and refreshingly straightforward in his communication style. We'd been having dinner together once or twice a month for several months, developing a friendship that might eventually become something more intimate if we both continued to feel compatible. But I was in no hurry to complicate my life with romantic relationships, and David seemed to appreciate my desire to take things slowly. The contrast with my marriage to Marcus's father was illuminating. At 28, I'd been desperate for security and validation, willing to ignore red flags and compromise my own needs to maintain a relationship that provided basic companionship and financial support. Now, at 63, I had the luxury of choosing companionship based on genuine compatibility rather than need. David and I enjoyed each other's company without feeling obligated to merge our lives or solve each other's problems. We could have disagreements without threatening the relationship's foundation, and we could maintain our individual interests and friendships without jealousy or possessiveness. It was the kind of mature partnership I'd never experienced before, based on choice rather than circumstance. These romantic possibilities felt like bonus features in a life that was already fulfilling rather than essential components required. For happiness, I'd learned to enjoy my own company, to find satisfaction in solitary activities, to build a support network that didn't depend on romantic partnership. If David and I developed a deeper relationship, it would enhance my contentment, rather than filling a void. The anniversary of Marcus's abandonment arrived on a scorching July day that reminded me viscerally of that morning when I'd stood outside the gas station watching his taillights disappear into the heat shimmer. But instead of grief or anger, the memory now triggered something closer to gratitude. That terrible day had been the beginning of the best period of my adult life. Being stripped of illusions about Marcus's character had been agonizing, but it had also freed me from the exhausting work of maintaining a relationship with someone who viewed me as an inconvenience, rather than a person worthy of respect and consideration. The financial disaster that had seemed so overwhelming had forced me to discover resources and capabilities I'd never needed to develop while I was focused on enabling someone else's success. The isolation that had felt like punishment had provided space for personal growth that wouldn't have been possible in the context of dysfunctional family obligations. I'd learned that love without reciprocity is a form of self-destruction rather than virtue. That loyalty to people who exploit your devotion is misguided rather than admirable. That protecting someone from the consequences of their choices often prevents them from developing the character necessary for genuine success and happiness. Most importantly, I'd learned that it's never too late to start over, to discover new aspects of your identity, to build relationships based on mutual respect, rather than need or habit. The woman who'd been abandoned in the desert bore little resemblance to the woman who now woke up each morning, eager to tackle the day's challenges and opportunities. The settlement money had made this transformation possible, but money alone couldn't have created the sense of purpose and belonging I'd found in Bitter Springs. That had required opening myself to new relationships, developing skills I'd never needed before, and gradually rebuilding trust in my own judgment after decades of deferring to others' opinions and priorities. On that anniversary evening, I hosted a dinner party for the friends who'd become my chosen family. Sarah and Tommy and Mrs. Chen gathered around my dining room table to share food I'd prepared with ingredients from my own garden, celebrating nothing more significant than our mutual affection and the simple pleasure of good company. The conversation ranged from local politics to Sarah's latest romance, to Tommy's concerns about his daughter's college plans, to Mrs. Chen's opinions about changes in the neighborhood. It was the kind of meandering, comfortable exchange that I'd never experienced during my years of managing Marcus's emotional needs and mediating his conflicts with the world. Nobody needed anything from me except my presence and attention. Nobody was performing for approval or manipulating for advantage. We were simply adults who enjoyed each other's company, sharing a meal and conversation without hidden agendas or unspoken resentments. As I looked around the table at these faces that had become dear to me, I realized that I'd finally learned to distinguish between family of origin and family of choice. Biology had given me a son who'd chosen to see me as a burden rather than a blessing. Geography and circumstance had given me friends who valued me for exactly who I was. The pain of losing Marcus would probably never disappear completely, but it had been transformed from an open wound into a scar that reminded me of lessons learned, rather than injuries still bleeding. He'd taught me what love looked like when it flowed in only one direction, and my Bitter Springs community had shown me what relationships felt like when care and consideration were mutual. Later that evening, after my guests had gone home and I was cleaning up the kitchen, I found myself thinking about the woman I'd been a year earlier. Desperate, manipulated, abandoned, and convinced that her life was essentially over at 62. She'd have been amazed to see the contentment and security I'd built from the ashes of everything she'd thought mattered. The catering business that had started as survival necessity had become a source of creative fulfillment and community connection. The friendships that had developed from practical cooperation had evolved into emotional bonds that felt more reliable than many family relationships. The financial independence that had seemed impossible to achieve had provided not just security, but freedom to make choices based on values rather than desperation. I was grateful to Marcus for one thing above all others, for forcing me to discover who I was when I wasn't defining myself through service to someone else's dreams. The woman he'd abandoned had strength, intelligence, and capacity for joy that had been buried under decades of self-sacrifice and misplaced loyalty. Recovering those lost aspects of myself had been worth every dollar of the settlement money, every sleepless night during the legal proceedings, every moment of uncertainty about whether justice would prevail over manipulation and wealth. The desert had taught me that survival was possible in the harshest conditions, but it had also shown me that growth and beauty could flourish in environments that seemed hostile to life. Like the Joshua trees that twisted skyward from seemingly barren soil, I'd learned to thrive in circumstances that others might consider impossible. Marcus had intended to dispose of me in that desert gas station to solve the problem of an inconvenient mother by relocating her beyond the boundaries of his carefully curated life. Instead, he'd given me the greatest gift imaginable: the opportunity to discover that I was worth far more than his limited vision had ever recognized. The woman he'd left behind had been diminished by years of putting others' needs first, convinced that her value depended on her usefulness to people who took her sacrifices for granted. The woman who'd emerged from that experience understood that her worth was inherent rather than earned, that she deserved respect and consideration regardless of what she could provide for others. As I turned off the lights and headed to my bedroom, I caught a glimpse of myself in the hallway mirror. The face looking back at me was older, more lined, marked by hardship in ways that couldn't be hidden. But the eyes were brighter than they'd been in years, and the expression was one of quiet confidence rather than anxious accommodation. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities. The catering business would continue to grow, requiring decisions about expansion and hiring. My relationships with David, Sarah, Tommy, and Mrs. Chen would continue to evolve in directions that couldn't be predicted or controlled. The desert landscape would change with the seasons, teaching me new lessons about resilience and adaptation. But tonight I was exactly where I belonged, in a home I'd chosen for myself, surrounded by evidence of a life built through my own efforts rather than inherited or granted by others' generosity. The journey from abandonment to empowerment had been longer and more difficult than I'd ever imagined possible, but it had led me to a destination worth every step of the struggle. Marcus had thought he was ending our relationship when he drove away from that gas station. In reality, he'd been giving me permission to start living for myself instead of through him. The mother he'd discarded had been replaced by a woman who knew her own worth and refused to accept anything less than the respect and consideration she deserved. That transformation, more than any financial settlement or legal victory, was the true measure of how completely I'd recovered from his betrayal. He'd intended to diminish me, and instead he'd revealed strengths I'd never known I possessed. The desert that was supposed to be my exile had become my sanctuary, and the isolation that was meant to be punishment had become the foundation for the richest, most authentic life I'd ever known. In trying to abandon me, Marcus had accidentally set me free, and I would spend the rest of my life being grateful for that unintended gift, even as I mourned the son I'd thought I was raising but had never really known. 2 years had passed since that scorching morning when everything changed, and I was standing in the kitchen of what had once been Mrs. Chen's restaurant, now transformed into the headquarters of Connie's Desert Catering. The expansion had been Sarah's idea, born from the practical reality that my home kitchen could no longer accommodate the volume of business we were handling. Mrs. Chen had decided to retire at 74, not because she had to, but because she wanted to travel and visit relatives in Taiwan before her arthritis made long flights impossible. When she offered to sell me the restaurant building at a price that reflected friendship more than market value, I saw an opportunity that seemed almost too perfect to be real. The commercial kitchen was everything I'd dreamed of during those cramped months of cooking elaborate wedding meals in my residential oven. Professional-grade equipment, walk-in refrigeration, prep spaces designed for efficiency rather than retrofitted from domestic layouts. The dining room had been converted into an office space where Sarah managed our growing roster of clients, and Maria, now a college sophomore studying business, handled social media marketing that had expanded our reach throughout Nevada and into neighboring states. The transformation of the building felt symbolic of my own evolution. What had been a modest family restaurant serving comfort food to locals had become a sophisticated catering operation that regularly handled events for hundreds of people. The change respected the building's history while adapting it to serve new purposes, much like I'd learned to honor my past while refusing to be limited by it. Business was booming in ways that sometimes felt surreal to someone who'd once rationed toilet paper and counted quarters for lunch money. We were booked solid through the following spring, with a waiting list for prime wedding dates and corporate clients from Las Vegas who'd discovered that exceptional food and personal service were worth the drive to a small desert town. The financial success was gratifying, but what I valued most was the sense of purposeful work that energized rather than depleted me. Every event we catered represented someone's important moment, whether it was a couple celebrating 50 years of marriage or a local business recognizing employee achievements. Being trusted to handle the details that made celebrations memorable felt like sacred work in ways that my previous jobs never had. Tommy had become my unofficial business partner, though he maintained his own mechanic shop and refused formal titles or profit-sharing arrangements that would complicate our friendship. He'd designed and built custom equipment that made our operation more efficient, from rolling prep stations to insulated transport containers that kept food at perfect temperatures during long-distance deliveries. His daughters had both graduated high school and were attending college in different states, but they returned to Bitter Springs during breaks and summer vacations to work for the catering company. Watching them develop confidence and professional skills reminded me of the satisfaction I'd once found in nurturing Marcus's potential, but without the desperate need for validation that had made that relationship so consuming and ultimately destructive. Maria had become particularly skilled at event coordination, possessing an intuitive understanding of customer psychology that allowed her to manage even the most demanding clients with grace and efficiency. She'd inherited her father's mechanical aptitude and her grandmother's business sense, creating a combination that made her invaluable to our operation. Her sister Elena was studying culinary arts at a community college in California, planning to return to Bitter Springs after graduation to expand our menu offerings and perhaps open a separate cafe that would serve regular meals in addition to catered events. The prospect of mentoring a formally trained chef excited me in ways that suggested my own learning and growth were far from finished. David and I had settled into a comfortable relationship that defied easy categorization. We weren't married and had no plans to marry, But we spent most evenings together and had developed the kind of easy intimacy that comes from truly knowing and accepting another person. His ranch provided a peaceful retreat from the intensity of catering work, and my business connections had helped him market his horses to clients throughout the Southwest. We maintained separate homes and independent financial lives, having both learned from previous relationships that love doesn't require complete merger of identity and resources. Our connection was built on shared values and mutual respect rather than need or convenience, creating a foundation that felt more solid than the desperate romantic attachments of my younger years. The relationship had taught me that partnership was possible without sacrifice, that I could care deeply for someone without losing myself in their needs or dreams. David appreciated my ambition and independence rather than feeling threatened by them, and I valued his steady presence without depending on him for validation or security. Sarah had also found love, though her romance followed a more traditional trajectory toward marriage and shared domesticity. She'd met Robert, a retired teacher from Las Vegas who'd moved to Bitter Springs to be closer to his elderly parents, and their courtship had the sweet deliberateness of mature people who understood the difference between infatuation and lasting compatibility. Their wedding was the first event I'd catered for someone who'd become genuine family, rather than simply a client. The celebration took place in Sarah's backyard, with string lights and desert wildflowers creating an atmosphere of intimate elegance that perfectly reflected her personality. Preparing food for people I loved felt different from commercial catering, infused with emotional investment that made every detail matter more deeply. The success of Sarah's wedding led to a new specialty service we called Intimate Celebrations, designed for couples who wanted exceptional food and professional coordination, but preferred small gatherings to elaborate productions. These events allowed us to focus on personal touches and customized menus that reflected clients' individual stories rather than following standardized wedding industry formulas. Mrs. Chen had returned from her travels with stories of family, reunions, and cultural experiences that reminded her why she'd immigrated to America decades earlier. She'd decided to stay in Bitter Springs permanently, purchasing a small house near mine where she could garden and volunteer at the library while remaining close to the community that had become her chosen family. Her presence in my daily life had evolved from practical cooperation to genuine affection based on shared values and complementary temperaments. She was still opinionated and occasionally abrasive, but her loyalty was absolute, and her advice was usually wise, even when it was unwelcome. Having her nearby felt like having a stern but loving aunt who cared enough to tell difficult truths when I needed to hear them. The expansion of my business had also meant hiring additional staff, which taught me lessons about leadership and management that I'd never expected to need. Finding reliable employees in a small town required patience and creativity, but it also provided opportunities to offer meaningful work to people who might otherwise have to leave Bitter Springs to find careers that matched their abilities. I'd hired 3 part-time cooks who worked in rotation depending on event schedules, allowing them to maintain other jobs or family responsibilities while developing professional skills that increased their value in the regional hospitality market. I'd also partnered with the local high school to offer internships that gave students exposure to business operations and culinary arts. These employment relationships felt different from the exploitative dynamics I'd experienced during my years of desperate job searching. I paid fair wages, provided flexible scheduling, and treated my employees as partners in creating exceptional experiences for our clients rather than replaceable labor to be managed and controlled. The respect and appreciation I received from my staff reminded me daily that my worth wasn't determined by how much I could sacrifice for others, but by how well I could balance my own needs with my responsibilities to people who depended on me. Leadership required strength and decisiveness rather than accommodation and self-denial. My literacy volunteer work had also expanded beyond individual tutoring to include organizing community education programs that addressed practical needs like financial literacy, computer skills, and small business development. These workshops drew participants from throughout the region, establishing Bitter Springs as a hub for adult education that attracted funding and resources from state and federal agencies. The programs had grown from my personal experience with educational gaps and financial manipulation, but they'd evolved into something that served broader community needs while providing me with intellectual stimulation that kept my mind sharp and engaged. Teaching adults reminded me that learning was a lifelong process that enriched both teacher and student. One of the most rewarding aspects of this work was watching people develop confidence in their own abilities, discovering skills and interests they'd never had opportunities to explore. A woman who'd started as a basic literacy student had become proficient enough with computers to launch an online business selling handmade jewelry. A man who'd needed help with basic math had learned enough about accounting to become bookkeeper for several local businesses. These success stories reminded me that transformation was possible at any age, that circumstances could change dramatically when people were given access to resources and support that respected their dignity while addressing their needs. My own journey from abandoned mother to successful business owner was dramatic, but not unique. It simply required the right combination of opportunity, determination, and community support. The anniversary of my settlement with Marcus now passed without the intense emotional reflection that had marked the first year. The grief had transformed into something more like scar tissue, visible evidence of past injury that no longer caused daily pain. I thought about him occasionally, usually when news stories mentioned the financial industry, or when I encountered other examples of adult children who'd betrayed their parents' trust and love. But these thoughts were increasingly analytical, rather than emotional, focused on understanding the psychological dynamics that created such cruelty, rather than mourning the relationship that had been lost. I'd learned enough about narcissistic behavior patterns to recognize that Marcus's actions had been predictable expressions of character defects that existed long before our final confrontation. The knowledge didn't eliminate the sadness of losing someone I'd loved unconditionally, but it did provide intellectual framework that prevented me from taking his rejection personally or wondering what I could have done differently to maintain his affection. Some people were simply incapable of genuine reciprocal relationships, and recognizing that reality was liberating rather than devastating. I'd also gained perspective on the broader social forces that had shaped both Marcus's behavior and my own responses to it. The cultural messaging that equated maternal love with unlimited sacrifice had made me vulnerable to exploitation, while the emphasis on individual achievement at any cost had given Marcus permission to view other people as resources to be consumed, rather than relationships to be nurtured. Understanding these patterns helped me recognize similar dynamics in other relationships and situations, allowing me to set boundaries and make choices that protected my well-being without requiring me to become cynical or withdrawn. I could offer help and support to people who needed it while maintaining awareness of whether my generosity was being appreciated or exploited. This wisdom had practical applications in my business relationships, where the skills I'd developed in managing difficult family dynamics translated into effective strategies for handling demanding clients and resolving conflicts between employees. The emotional intelligence I'd gained through surviving betrayal and rebuilding my life made me a better leader and mentor. 3 years after the settlement, I received an unexpected piece of information that provided closure I hadn't realized I still needed. Diana Foster, the attorney who'd represented me in the case against Marcus, called to inform me that the criminal investigation into the investment fraud network had finally resulted in arrests and convictions. Earl and his associates had been sentenced to federal prison terms for conspiracy to commit wire fraud, mail fraud, and money laundering. The scheme had ultimately victimized more than 40 people across 6 states, with total losses exceeding $2 million. Most victims had been middle-aged or elderly individuals who'd been recruited through family members or acquaintances who received finder's fees for delivering vulnerable targets. The investigation had revealed that Marcus had been more deeply involved in the criminal network than we'd initially understood. He'd not only received payment for recruiting me, but had also provided detailed financial information about my assets and vulnerabilities that allowed the criminals to customize their approach for maximum effectiveness. Federal prosecutors had considered including Marcus in the criminal charges, but his cooperation with the investigation and his payment of restitution to me had persuaded them to accept a plea agreement that required him to provide testimony against the other defendants. Without facing prosecution himself, Diana explained that Marcus's cooperation had been crucial in securing convictions and recovering assets that were used to provide partial restitution to other victims who hadn't been as fortunate as I was in obtaining civil settlements. His testimony had revealed the sophisticated psychological manipulation techniques the network used to identify and exploit vulnerable individuals. The information was satisfying in ways I hadn't anticipated. Knowing that justice had been served and that other victims had received some compensation felt like vindication that went beyond my personal situation. The criminal convictions validated my decision to pursue legal action rather than accepting Marcus's manipulation and abuse as inevitable family dysfunction. More importantly, learning about the broader criminal network helped me understand that I hadn't been targeted because of personal failings or weaknesses, but because I'd fit a profile that professional criminals had developed through extensive experience with financial fraud. The manipulation I'd experienced was sophisticated and intentional, rather than opportunistic or improvised. This knowledge completed a process of emotional healing that had been hindered by lingering questions about my own judgment and vulnerability. I'd been victimized by experts who'd perfected their techniques through practice on dozens of other people. Not because I was unusually gullible or naive, but because the circumstances of my life had made me an attractive target for predators who specialized in exploiting parental love and financial desperation. The criminal convictions also provided a sense of protection for the future. The individuals who'd orchestrated the investment fraud scheme were now in federal prison where they couldn't continue victimizing other families. The law enforcement investigation had disrupted their operations and created precedents that would help prosecutors pursue similar cases more effectively. Diana had kept copies of all documentation from my case, including evidence of Marcus's participation in the criminal network. This material would remain available if needed for future legal proceedings, but more importantly, it served as insurance against any attempts he might make to resume contact or manipulation. The finality was exactly what I needed to close this chapter of my life completely. Marcus had faced appropriate consequences for his actions. Other victims had received some measure of justice, and the criminals who'd exploited us all had been removed from society where they couldn't continue their predatory behavior. I celebrated this news quietly, sharing dinner with David at his ranch while we watched the sunset paint the desert mountains in familiar shades of gold and crimson. The conversation ranged from business plans to travel possibilities to speculation about whether Maria and Elena would eventually take over the catering company when I was ready to retire. These discussions about the future felt comfortable and optimistic in ways that would have been impossible during my years of financial insecurity and family dysfunction. I could make plans based on preferences rather than desperation, knowing that I had resources and relationships that would support whatever choices I made. The business had grown to the point where it could operate successfully with less direct involvement from me, opening possibilities for travel, education, or other pursuits that I'd deferred during the intense years of building financial security and professional reputation. I was 65 years old, in excellent health, and finally free to explore aspects of life that had been postponed or abandoned during decades of survival-focused decision-making. Sarah and I had discussed the possibility of opening a second location in Las Vegas, taking advantage of our reputation and client base to expand into a larger market that could support more diverse services. The idea was appealing but not urgent, allowing us to research and plan carefully rather than rushing into commitments that might compromise the quality and values that had built our success. Tommy had suggested that I consider teaching business courses at the community college, sharing the practical knowledge I'd gained through building a successful enterprise from desperate circumstances. The idea intrigued me as a way to help other people develop skills and confidence while keeping my own mind engaged with new challenges. These possibilities represented choices rather than necessities, luxuries rather than survival strategies. Having options felt revolutionary after decades of being constrained by circumstances beyond my control. The freedom to say no to opportunities that didn't align with my values or interests was as valuable as the ability to say yes to possibilities that excited and challenged me. As David and I cleared the dinner dishes and prepared for a quiet evening on his porch, I reflected on the Taoi journey that had brought me to this moment of contentment and possibility. The woman who'd been abandoned at a desert gas station with $17 and a broken heart bore little resemblance to the person I'd become through surviving that betrayal and building a new life from its ashes. The transformation had required facing painful truths about someone I'd loved unconditionally, learning to distinguish between family of origin and family of choice, and developing skills and confidence that had been suppressed by years of accommodating other people's needs. But it had also revealed strengths and capacities that I'd never known existed within me. The desert that had initially seemed like exile had become sanctuary, teaching lessons about resilience and adaptation that couldn't have been learned in more comfortable environments. The isolation that was intended as punishment had provided space for personal growth that wouldn't have been possible within the constraints of dysfunctional family obligations. Most importantly, I'd learned that it was never too late to start over, to discover new aspects of identity, to build relationships based on mutual respect rather than need or habit. The second half of my life had become richer and more authentic than the first half had ever been, precisely because it was based on choices rather than circumstances. Marcus had intended to dispose of me when he drove away from that gas station, solving the problem of an inconvenient mother by relocating her beyond the boundaries of his carefully constructed image. Instead, he'd given me the greatest gift imaginable, the opportunity to discover who I really was when I wasn't defining myself through service to someone else's dreams. The irony was perfect and complete. In trying to abandon me, he'd accidentally set me free. And I would spend the rest of my life grateful for that unintended liberation, even as I continued to mourn the son I'd thought I was raising, but had never really known. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities, but tonight I was exactly where I belonged, surrounded by people who valued me for who I was, rather than what I could provide, secure in the knowledge that I'd built something meaningful and lasting through my own efforts and determination. The journey from abandonment to empowerment had been longer and more difficult than I'd ever imagined possible, but it had led me to a destination that was worth every step of the struggle. The woman Marcus had tried to discard had become someone he could never have imagined, independent, successful, and completely free from the need for his approval or presence in her life. 5 years later, I stood in the boardroom of a Lassie Vegas hotel, presenting our proposal to cater their annual corporate retreat series. The executives around the mahogany table listened intently as I outlined how Connie's Desert Catering could provide authentic regional cuisine and personalized service that would set their events apart from standard hotel offerings. The irony wasn't lost on me. Marcus had brought me to this same city to trap me in a fraudulent business scheme, and now I was returning as a successful entrepreneur whose reputation had spread far beyond the small desert community where it all began. The woman he'd tried to dispose of had built something he could never have envisioned. The contract we secured that day represented the largest single client in our company's history. But more than that, it validated the journey I'd taken from desperate survival to confident leadership. Walking out of that hotel into the Nevada sunshine, I felt the same sense of possibility that had sustained me through the hardest days of rebuilding my life. Bitter Springs remained my home and headquarters, but our reach now extended throughout the Southwest. We employed 15 people full-time and twice that number for large events, creating opportunities in a region where meaningful work had always been scarce. The success felt complete, not just because of financial achievements, but because it had lifted up an entire community. Marcus never contacted me again after the settlement, and I never reached out to him. Sometimes I wondered if he thought about the mother he'd abandoned, whether he'd learned anything from the consequences of his choices, whether his marriage had survived the exposure of his criminal behavior. But these questions held only academic interest rather than emotional weight. The son I'd raised was gone, replaced by a stranger whose decisions belonged to him alone. The grief had transformed into acceptance, and the acceptance had given way to gratitude for the unexpected freedom his betrayal had provided. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.